This is symbol 7. And were I lecturing 2,000 years ago, etiquette would decree that I should keep one hand in my lap, and if I have to gesture, only use the one hand freed by the toga, or if wearing Greek dress, the hymation. But this being the 20th century, I can use both hands. And let's start by bringing these hands together like this. This simple action is a perceptual integration. In fact, this action occurred symbolically in the human mind in response to a very long evolution of some tens of thousands of years. About 30,000 years ago, the universal form of prayer was this position called in ancient Greek the orans position. And it meant praying by being open to the mystery of nature, to the wild synchronicity of fire engine sirens going by just as one is talking about such things. It was only in very slow motion by centuries, even by millennia, that prayer brought the hands together. And they were about like this in about 4000 BC. And this form of prayer, distinct from the orans position of very ancient Paleolithic man, this orans position was like the summation of Neolithic man, and still is retained in ancient archaic Judaism, for instance, of a laying on of the hands, or of healing the body by putting resonance from someone's order onto your body. But further evolution brought the hands together. And when the hands are together like this, you no longer have Paleolithic or Neolithic, but you have symbolic civilization. And so this simple motion, this simple action encapsulates a history of about 40,000 years of human endeavor, of moving from a Paleolithic openness to the participation mystique of nature, as Lucien Lévy-Bruhl said so eloquently, and his wonderful books on primitive man, that wisdom in primitive men and women, wisdom was to participate with nature, to join the flow, the emergence, the ongoingness, the continuity, the endless continuity of nature. And in fact, a French thinker like Henri Bergson, with his profound idea of durée, that time is a duration, is not a measurement at all, but a duration, and that one has an élan vital, one has a life energy when one is participating in this duration. And that participation is fertile in the sense that it is creative. And so one has a creative continuity by participating with the mystery of nature. But by the time of Neolithic men and women, the concern was not to participate. The archetypal idea was to tame nature by selection. The taming of the animals, the taming of the plants, the taming of human groups. Instead of just harvesting the plants where they grew, one selected out the seeds and plants that one wished to emphasize, and one cultivated them in places that you chose. Instead of just following the animals in their nomadic cycles of existence, one selected out those animals that one wished, and tamed them, interbred them, brought out more and more traits that one wished to have. When we look at a stalk of bread wheat, we see the product of several thousand years of experiment and two distinct mutations. The original goat grass that grows wild has most of the energy of the seed gone into making a wing, a set of wings, plant wings, that carry the seed on the wind. But when that goat grass was transformed by two distinct mutations into emer, into bread wheat, all of the energy went into making mini nodules on the grain part, and no energy was left for any wings. And so bread wheat cannot seed itself except to drop gravitationally to the ground where it is. And so bread wheat can only be sown by the hand of man. And so one of the great archetypal symbols of Neolithic civilization was the individual who at planting time carried a bag of seeds and sowed these by hand, so that the hand of man became the breath of God, became the wind that helped nature to become bountiful and nourishing. So that Paleolithic people who participated in nature, Paleolithic men and women who followed the animals, who followed the plants so closely that they folded themselves into the identity of the plants, into the identity of the animals. The earliest portrayal of a human being, some 30,000 years ago in southern France, shows not a human head, but it shows shamanistically an animal head on a human body. Not that we were chimeras. We were certainly never half animal and half man. We were not minotaurs. But the minotaur, the bull's head on the human body, is a Paleolithic identification that nature is a mystery, and life, to be fruitful, we have to participate in the mystery of nature. We dare not interfere with it. And so for Paleolithic men and women, the Neolithic idea of taming nature would have been a sacrilege. And indeed, the masculine element of humanity, which was much more successful in a Paleolithic world, the prowess of men's strength, of men's battle responses, their patrolling the outskirts and boundaries, much more suited to a Paleolithic temperament. And so the Neolithic era was an antagonism between men and women, in the sense that the feminine was used to occupying centers that were transformable. We saw with Jane Goodall's work on her chimpanzees that even in primate populations that split off 70, 80 million years ago, female chimpanzees occupy a center. Male chimpanzees patrol the boundaries. If a male chimpanzee transgresses the threshold of the territory and enters some other territory, the males of that territory will initiate conflict, combat, instantly, spontaneously, as it were. But a female chimpanzee is able to move out of that territory without being challenged, without being challenging. She's welcomed into any territory and is at home in any center. So that there is a movable feast in terms of feminine centeredness, but there's a exclusive polarity, a polarizing quality to the masculine, which the Neolithic civilization era of our kind brought out, emphasized. And so the transcendent qualities in Neolithic civilization became feminine. In order to tame nature, in order to tame the plants, the animals, humankind. And it takes taming to have people clustered together in cities of more than several dozen individuals. Even villages already take something. In cities of several thousand, it's a real problem. And as we know today, megacities of 10 million, it's an enormous problem. Taming humanity is much more difficult than taming animals or taming plants or taming the geology. Mining is a kind of a Neolithic quality of going in for elements out of nature, bringing the metals out of the veins of the mountains and using them. And Neolithic civilization characterized by the tremendous ability to smelt copper and to use copper and to make copper instruments which require just a little trace of tin in order to firm them up. The raw copper doesn't really hold its shape very well, but with a little bit of tin, it becomes very useful. And so metal implements, like domestic animals or domestic plants, become a quality of Neolithic men and women. But the emphasis there on integration is rather a feminine mode rather than the masculine mode of the Paleolithic. But the symbolic civilization, when the Paleolithic hands came to the point of the Neolithic laying on of hands, and then further evolved to the symbolic prayer, the hands brought together like this. The masculine and feminine elements had to be brought together in an interpenetration, in a unity, in something new. This quality of symbolic civilization is relatively recent, only about 5,000, 6,000 years at the most. But as someone like Goethe observed, if you're going to be alive in the modern world, you have to be at least 6,000 years old. You have to have an education which recapitulates all of these levels. Otherwise, you are cut adrift from any kind of foundation. And that foundation cut adrift from the preceding foundation, and one is lost, as it were, in life. And so symbolic men and women put the emphasis on an integral education that brought all the phases in a cycle to a maturation and a maturity. And so even as early as 5,000 years ago, one finds a wisdom tradition where what's intelligent about the wisdom tradition is that the cycles are complete. How does one know when a cycle is complete? When that cycle is complete, it doesn't stop, but it transforms. It transforms into a higher order cycle. One knows that this sequence of rituals is complete because the very next ritual occurs on a different order. And the guide mark always is that this new order begins a new cycle. It has its own cycle. And any phase in the new cycle is powerful enough to index the entirety of the old cycle, so that the old cycle no longer occurs as a sequence, but occurs as a set. And so when cycles of ritual comportment becomes available as sets, a ritual on a higher order that exercises a transformation on any part, on any ritual in that cycle, affects the entirety of the set. And so a higher order ritual not only changes a lower order ritual, but changes the entire set to which it belongs. And so a great principle in symbolic civilization, already there in the pyramid text of ancient Egypt, the Pyramid of Unas, some 2600 BC. Already, there's the understanding that if this can happen once or twice, how many times can it happen? And so the great exploration 5,000 years ago of intelligent men and women was to explore this realm of sets of ritual order. And the only vehicle that was capable of exploring this was not mythology, but symbols. And so symbols were developed in that age. The 2000s BC were an age of exploring symbols and symbolic capacity, trying to understand and explore something which was of use and of need. The men and women of that age to be intelligent, not only to survive, they could have survived on the Paleolithic level if there had been enough game, enough food, but in places like Egypt there weren't. It was only by cultivation that there was enough food, enough game. So too in the Indus Valley civilization of India. It was a wonderful Neolithic civilization very early on, 10,000 BC. But when the desiccation of the Indus Valley began to really happen around 2000 BC, all of a sudden the symbolic civilization was not enough. And in the Indus civilization, one finds an even higher order than symbolic civilization. The need to penetrate even farther than symbols could reach, farther than the integral ordering of nature could reach. And so one finds in the Indus civilization, about 1800, 1600 BC, one finds this great leap into a transcendental level. Men and women finding that they could explore a level higher than symbols, a level of supernatural consciousness, a level of yoga. And one begins to have the first inquiries, the first movements away from Vedic ritual into a Brahmanic, Upanishadic kind of intelligence. A level higher than symbolic civilization. And while that was the concern of Indus Valley civilization as a whole in its crisis of desiccation, in the Egyptian civilization, there was no crisis like that, but rather that development was limited to an avant-garde population of people. And so transcendental wisdom in the Egyptian civilization became esoteric, whereas transformation into a transcendental realm in the Indus civilization became endemic. It became a part of a higher life, became a recognized part of the higher end of life. And so it's not a surprise in India when someone goes off to explore transcendental wisdom, it's assumed that this is a part of life. It's that stage, that phase. Whereas in Greco-Egyptian civilization, it was considered esoteric, really strange. And when the Romans, who were not very esoteric at all, swallowed Greco-Egyptian civilization whole without chewing any of it, to the Roman, it became downright peculiar that a man or a woman would wish to explore something transcendental. How un-Roman, how unlawful. Let's look up and see what laws you've broken. And so these kinds of traits, these kinds of prejudices are passed on. And we find ourselves in a world of intersecting resonances, some of which are extremely easy to deal with and others are impossible to deal with. To say nothing of the middle sibling of those civilizations, the middle sibling of the Euphrates, the Tigris Euphrates, which had yet a different take, considered that it was not so much that men and women explored transcendental things as a part of life, or that men and women in very limited esoteric groups of one or two explored these transcendental realms, but that the transcendental realms changed the nature of man permanently. So we were not men and women anymore, but we were divine beings. We were angelic beings. And so in the Euphrates civilization, where that transformation happened, one has not the yogi of India or the esoteric individual of Greco-Roman Egypt, but one has a divine being, an angel, or if it's unsuccessful, a demon. When you look at the archaeology of India, you don't find winged figures. The yogis don't have wings. Where have you seen a yogi with wings? But in Iran, in Iraq, there you find angels and demons, because the transcendental realms are populated, not by men and women, but by divine powers that have come into play as beings. And so you find in three great river civilizations completely different ways of relating to a similar threshold being crossed. And we today can take a look at the two great civilizations in China, the river civilization of the Yellow River, the Huanghe, or the river civilization of the Yangtze, and we find two completely different kinds of Chinese. The northern Chinese of the Yellow River are a dynastic Chinese. Whether it was ancient Chang'an, which is modern Xi'an, on the Yellow River, or Luoyang on the other side of the great mountain ranges, still on that river, or Beijing, or Tianjin, which are all cognate cities, all cognate tribal areas along the Yellow River. One always finds a kind of dynastic quality transcending, taking symbolic civilization into an imperial realm. One finds the imperial Mandarin mentality even today. I remember once in Canada talking to some Chinese engineers. They were just engineers. And I said, well, you're from Beijing. And they said, oh, we're from Beijing. It's important. It's imperial. But the Yangtze River, linking places like Chongqing or Shanghai, they're not interested in imperial things at all. They're interested in business. They're interested in commerce. They're interested, like the famous New Yorker phrase, in making a deal. What do you have and how much is it? And what do we have that you're interested in? The Chinese word for business, mai. Mai with a falling tone means sell, and mai with a rising tone means buy. Buy, sell. It's business. The Yangtze civilization is interested in the interchange and exchange of goods, of things, of material, whereas the northern Chinese are interested in corralling the monopoly. It reminds one of the saying in Bud Schulberg's What Makes Sammy Run, the ultimate Hollywood novel. Sammy Glick's motto is, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable. So one has in human history at least 5 different types of civilization, 5 different emphases that came out all roughly in the same period of time. The transformation of symbolic civilization into something further. And that this was such a struggle that it's incomplete till this day. And so symbolic civilization in crisis has characterized at least the last 5,000 years of mankind's development. If one looks to find what resolving medium is available, what kind of medium is there where some resolution to this crisis and this ongoing problem could be found, the medium is in language. Whatever resolution is going to hold and be effective, it's in language. And so the inspection, the observation, the learning about language was one of the great transforming elements. And it didn't happen in the Yellow River civilization or the Yangtze civilization. It didn't happen in the Euphrates civilization. It happened in the Indus and in the Nile civilizations. And the investigation of language in the Egyptian was always co-opted in the esoteric groups. And so the investigations of language in terms of its protean symbolic capacity was developed, but only developed for the few. The hieroglyphs were not for the many, but for the few. In fact, they were increasingly limited for only one, the pharaoh. All of the work of the pyramid is not to encase a number of people, but to encase one person, the pharaoh. And so the development of esoteric, symbolic information in the Greco-Egyptian lineage was always of such a nature that characteristically it could only be passed from one person to one other person, from one to one. It took a tremendous development by Plato to be able to take this into a different mode where the philosophic dialogue was not just between one and one, but included a third or more parties. But the most effective Platonic dialogues are those where it's a one-on-one. And so very often in Platonic dialogues, keeping with the esoteric Greco-Egyptian lineage, the moving focus of exploration of symbols and ideas, of language, is where there's one individual. And so we're going to take one of Plato's dialogues in 2 weeks. One of Plato's dialogues where the subject of the dialogue is itself the very content that we would wish to explore. What is language? What is myth? How does it happen? How is it used? And that Platonic dialogue is the Phaedrus. It's about the development of symbolic language in ancient Egypt, about how Thoth developed it for the pharaoh in ancient Egypt. Only Plato is doing a series of putting sets of information together so that those who participate in hearing the dialogue between Socrates and Phaedrus, with a few other figures thrown in because Plato was constantly trying to push the outsides of the envelope, open up philosophic discourse so it wasn't just one-to-one in the ancient symbolic lineage of a master teaching a disciple, but to open it up a little bit. So we're going to take Plato's Phaedrus, but this is no education like some academic kind of a medieval drama. Most academic courses are like medieval dramas. They're made to convince you that they are right in terms of their doctrine orientation. Instead of taking a single book as a text, we always pair them up. And we take pairs of books which ostensibly would be disparate, having nothing to do with each other. But by pairing them, bringing them into a consonant quality. We change, we transform the value of the book out of its text possibilities into its differential qualities. We do an end run around the scholastic reductionism. That's the very basis of doctrinaire ideologies. And by doing an end run around that, we open up differential consciousness to the exploring kind of adventure, what Alfred North Whitehead used to call the adventure of ideas. And you'll see that Whitehead is important to today's lecture in just a minute. The pair with Plato's Phaedrus that we're going to get to in 2 weeks is Yeats's book called A Vision. Now, Yeats was enamored with big, beautiful Irish woman named Maud Gonne for most of his life. He was just catastrophically in love with her. He was garroted by the image of the dynamic revolutionary goddess. But he married a different woman. He married a woman who, in order to really be, to blend, to meld, to be with Yeats, who was one of the greatest poets who has ever lived, one of the greatest esoteric poets who's ever lived, was an esoteric poet in the ancient Greco-Egyptian lineage. In order to be with him, she opened herself up to her inner depths, and what came out, because she was not university trained, she was not philosophically trained, but what came out was an explosion of automatic writing. She automatically wrote page after page after page and saved them all until she had literally a suitcase full of seemingly random automatic writings from her deep inside. But Yeats, being a symbolic magus in the ancient Greco-Roman lineage, refused to believe that the deep psyche was chaotic. The deep psyche is organized. What is chaotic is that it comes through a filter of undisciplined language. And it's possible to refocus that undisciplined language to a focused language and recover the order. And so he devoted a great deal of his married life to trying to make sense out of, to make a pattern out of his wife's automatic writings. And towards the end of his life, he succeeded. Yeats is a real classic case, by the way. He was not only in the Greco-Egyptian lineage of the one-to-one magas. Yeats was the head of the Order of the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He's the one that threw Aleister Crowley out. He said, wisdom schools are not reform schools. We're not out to improve the manners of recalcitrants. But Yeats was also informed, because he was a world-class poet. He was great friends with Rabindranath Tagore. In fact, he's the one that got Rabindranath Tagore the Nobel Prize for Literature. But Rabindranath Tagore's father was one of the greatest yogis of modern India, was an ancient Upanishad-trained yogi. And so Rabindranath Tagore conveyed to Yeats that there was a tremendous, interesting comparison to his esoteric Greco-Egyptian civilization lineage with that of India, and that the core of the Indian civilization was there in two great bodies of literature, one a center point called the Bhagavad Gita, and the other a great circumference of a cycle of transcendental texts called the Upanishads. And so Yeats took the time to learn enough Sanskrit that he could help make his own translations of the Upanishads and of the Bhagavad Gita. And so the old Yeats had available to him a kind of stereoptic vision of two great transcendental civilizations, transcending symbols in two distinct ways, one an esoteric Egyptian Greek, and the other a very broad, quote, ordinary an exoteric quality of transcendence characteristic of India. In India, everything hangs out. Everything is a part of on the street. Someone once asked Mahatma Gandhi, they said, well, if you want to be a karma yogi, why don't you go to the Himalayas and go to a cave? And he said, my dear, I carry my cave with me every day. Yeats got the stereoptic vision. And when he had the capacities of the esotericness of Hermetic Western and the Upanishadic Bhagavad Gita-centered India, he was able to focus and bring out of his wife's automatic writings a universal pattern, which he wrote down in a vision. And a vision published in 1937 is one of the world's greatest books. It takes out of what to anyone else would have been sheer, chaotic, almost neurotic madness, and shows that there was an archetypal pattern, and that the voice belonged not to his wife so much as to a man named Michael Robarts, who didn't live back in some time so much, but lived in a present quality of imaginary time-space. And that the depths of the transcendental consciousness is not limited by the openness of the symbolic mind, which is already infinite, but the field of transcendental consciousness exceeds the cosmos. It is able to incorporate into its dimensions even imaginary realms as factual actualities. So one doesn't just have all time-space, but has all imaginary time-space as well. Every conceivable dimension is accessible. And so Yeats in the vision brings out and focuses. And what does he find? He finds that there is a 28-stage phase quality to the esoteric, which has two intersecting cones, a cone of darkness and a cone of light, which interpenetrating make a wholeness and a fullness, which is not available to be reduced to a thing. That the whole operation of thingness is like inconsequential molecular level compared to the reality. The reality which is not only participable, we can participate in this supercosmic reality, but we can also tame it. We can also symbolically focus it. And we can also miraculously transcend even that. And so Yeats' a vision and Plato's Phaedrus we're going to use together for about 4 weeks, starting in 2 weeks, and see where that takes us. And where that takes us is the end of the first year and the trigger effect of beginning the whole second year of our education. Because the whole second year is a surprise. The whole second year is a cycle that never happened in nature. Wherever one looks in the universe, naturally it never occurs. It never will occur, it never did occur. Nevertheless, it is real. And it's the realm of vision, of art, of history, and of science. And this whole supranatural realm, this whole supernatural cycle, is the flower and the fruit of an educational cultivation. But today, we're still in Symbol 7. We're still looking at another pair of books. We're looking at Blake's illustrations to Job, and we're looking at Suzanne Langer's great little book, Philosophy in a New Key, a study in the symbolism of right, reason, and art. And when we come back from the break, we'll look at this pair closer today. But let's conclude. Let's conclude with a contrast. Suzanne Langer is a distant descendant out of the Greco-Egyptian esoteric tradition. She learned because her teacher was extraordinary. And not only did she have just one extraordinary teacher, she had two. And so Susanne Langer is one of the most incredible minds of the 20th century. If you're looking for a female philosopher who's like an A+, Susanne Langer will do. Her great teachers were Alfred North Whitehead and Ernst Cassirer. She writes in Philosophy in a New Key on page 144, the following statement, which we're going to use as a seed when we come back from the break. She writes this: if language is born, indeed, from the profoundly symbolic character of the human mind, we may not be surprised to find that this mind tends to operate with symbols far below the level of speech. Now that is kind of a conundrum at first, and it takes a while to open that up. And when we open it up, we find both positives and negatives, pros and cons, as one would expect. My old friend Jacob Needleman said, philosophy for us begins with opening up questions. Just getting to the questions is what can be delivered to you, but opening the question is what we have to do together. And so when we come back after the break, we'll take a look at a question that comes out of this and open it up. The opening up of the question of language vis-a-vis Susanne Langer's philosophy of a functional new key to thought brings us in close proximity to Blake's illustrations for the book of Job. In fact, when one looks at the book of Job, amazingly, there are 22 plates, 21 of which are numbered. And if you look at 21 in terms of the synthesizing title page, on the title page of Blake's book of Job, one finds a cascade of angels. Remember that the angels come from Iranian civilization, not from India, not from Egypt. They come from Iranian civilization. But the cascade of angels is quite distinct in that there are 7. There are only 7. And in fact, angelic orders always have 7 and only 7 levels. To the extent that the Greek word for the set of the 7 angels is the haimarmene. If one looks at Blake's Job in terms of a set of 7, the 21 numbered cards arrange themselves in a sequence of 3 sets of 7. So if one looks at the 7th, the 14th, and the 21st card, one should then get the 3 great quantum jumps in symbolism for Blake's Job. And indeed, one has that. What comes to mind instantly is a question. Blake has 3 sets of 7, but a lunar cycle has 4 sets of 7. And yet the direct contact, the direct initiator of Blake in the 19th century, early 20th century was Yeats. Yeats learned from Blake. He learned like master to disciple. Not because they had physical contact, but because they had symbolic contact. And we'll talk about that. How does a set of 3 7s get transformed to a set of 4 7s? Because the 0-numbered title page of Blake is a set in and of itself, which Yeats, being the magus he was able to open up and show that it also had 7 elements. Let's come back. Let's come back to a very intriguing question. The question is, where does language come from? Why do we have language? How do we have language? Where does it come from? In her book on Philosophy in a New Key, Susanne Langer page 109, talking about language. She's saying, the problem is baffling. It throws us back upon an old and mystifying problem. If we find no prototype of speech in the highest animals, and man will not say even the first word by instinct, then how did all the tribes acquire their various languages? Who began the art which we now all have to learn? And why is it not restricted to the cultured races, but possessed by every primitive family, from darkest Africa to the loneliness of the polar ice? Even the simplest of practical arts, such as cooking, clothing, or pottery, is sometimes found wanting in one human group or another, or at least found in rudimentary forms. Language is neither absent nor archaic in any of them. She quotes here the great anthropologist who was also one of the early linguists, Edward Sapir, from his article in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences. The telling sentence in her quotation from Sapir: "In the first place, it has come to be realized that there exist no truly primitive languages in a symbolic sense." Languages seem to occur full-blown. The problem is simple and reoccurs in written languages because the very first indications that we have of a written language, like the hieroglyphs of the pyramid text of ancient Egypt, right away the language is highly developed. The cycle is complete. The cycle of wisdom is complete. Everything is already there. What was not available to Suzanne Langer in the 1940s is available to us in the 1990s. For instance, vis-a-vis the mystery of written language, literacy, written language, is preceded by a very long development of numeracy. Men and women used numerical notation for thousands of years before they used a designation of anything literate. So numeracy precedes literacy. So that the act of counting, even in written form, precedes the use of a written language by many thousands of years, 5, 6, 7,000 years. The development of counting, of this numerical line, of the cardinal sequence, is essential before language is able to develop almost like a resonance of the line of counting. In fact, when one comes to some of the profound investigations like Richard Dedekind, Essays on the Theory of Numbers, one of the great little classics in mathematics, or the further developments, someone like Kurt Gödel, on formally undecidable propositions of Principia Mathematica and related systems. The Principia Mathematica of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead. When one comes to this kind of an arena, one finds indeed that there are all kinds of precursors, but that the patterning, the sequencing, the evolution, the development was not really recognized, even as recent as the 1940s. But by the 1990s, one can begin to understand because one can begin to see. There's all the difference in the world between nature and the concept of nature. One of the teachers of Suzanne Langer, Alfred North Whitehead, many seminal books to his credit. This one, a development from the first edition 1920, this is 1955 reprint, The Concept of Nature. Tarner Lectures delivered at Trinity College, November 1929. The Concept of Nature. Chapter 7, entitled simply Objects. The first couple of sentences, right away, show a different quality of mentality operating at very high speed. The ensuing lecture is concerned with the theory of objects. Objects are elements in nature which do not pass. The awareness of an object as some factor not sharing in the passage of nature is what I call recognition. It is impossible to recognize an event because an event is essentially distinct from every other event. Recognition is an awareness of sameness. One of Whitehead's most famous books, in fact, one of the seminal books of 20th century Western philosophy, is called Process and Reality. So refined as to be almost unreadable. Part of the humor of it is that it was so refined that editors of it at the university press where it was published did not sufficiently pay attention to the nuances of the script of the text, and so many errors crept in which were not caught by anyone until some 40 years later, when some very perspicacious readers, comparing Alfred North Whitehead's manuscript with the published accepted text of Process and Reality, noticed that all kinds of errors had crept in. It was like a mistaken printing of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. And so about 5 years ago, they published Process and Reality finally in a correct form. It's still difficult to read, but not as impossible as the original edition. Whitehead is extraordinary because he was able to take enough time. It's a process that was developed in very esoteric Mahayana Buddhism in China. It was a technique developed into a sect of Buddhism called Huayan, flowering matrix Buddhism. And the principle there, and Huayan Buddhism, is accumulated penetration. And Alfred North Whitehead, like a yogi, Western yogi, all by himself developed the process of accumulated penetration. It's like someone who looks at the night sky. And you can look at the night sky seemingly forever and just see so much, and that's it. But when you begin to constellate the night sky and to use those constellations in movement cycles, one begins then to see, in an accumulated penetration, you see relationalities that were never observable before because they were not there before. They do not occur in the night sky. They occur in the participation of the observer and the night sky together. They occur in an interface between the mind and nature. That interface of the mind and nature is an alchemical interpenetration. So not only do you have an accumulated penetration of the mind vis-a-vis nature, but there's a reciprocity because the mystery of nature always has a reciprocity. As you see more and more into nature, nature offers you more and more to see into. It's an old Hermetic principle. It even happens on level of geology. A magma which engulfs pre-existing material incorporates a lot of the qualities of the pre-existing material into the new magma when it solidifies. This endomorphosis, this quality of changing reality as it happens in process, is the essence of alchemy. And it turns out that man's perception is not alchemical until the mind begins to participate with it. And then the mind's conception is alchemical. In perception, the Zen of perception, one can see what is, to the extent of seeing what is not also. What is not doesn't occur exactly, and what is occurs precisely, exactly. But with a conceptual addition, that dimension to seeing, you can change what you see as you look. The looking is creative. One of the 20th century's greatest artists, when he was a little boy, sick in bed one time, looking at the knots in the wood on the wall. The little boy's name was Max Ernst. Was suddenly surprised to see that as he looked, the knots took on the character of living beings that danced in his creative seeing. And no wonder Max Ernst grew up to be one of the greatest surrealist artists. And Max Ernst's quality of surrealism is quite different from that of, say, like Salvador Dali. Dali's surrealism is a surrealism of juxtapositions of ideas, whereas Max Ernst's surrealism is a permutation, a metamorphosis of perception itself by an alchemical openness. The concept is not an idea which brings juxtaposition into play, but it's an idea that serves as an invisible denominator to the permutations of the numeral qualities, the matrix qualities of the numeracy of the natural world. That is to say, nature is a mystery. Also operates not just as a set of things, but operates as a matrix of openness, which permutates and metamorphoses and changes constantly if given an interface of creative conception upon which this can happen. So that to the creative individual, the universe is ever new, because it is ever new. The unexpected, the unknown, the imaginary constantly happen and come into play. And so one has a very different kind of quality. If one takes the old-fashioned way of reductive thought, of having thinking reduced down, the archetype of this would be the tandem of Descartes and Kant. It's called idealism. And one of Suzanne Langer's teachers, Ernst Cassirer, is the great 20th century example of Kantian idealism. In fact, he wrote this beautiful biography of Kant, Kant's Life and Thought by Ernst Cassirer. And when one comes to the very crux, the very element here of Cassirer's writing on Kant, the very end of the book, we find this kind of a quotation. Something that cannot be investigated remains unknown. It is no longer a mere negation, however, but rather it becomes the rule of knowledge and action. It is no longer the expression of an impotent and hopeless skepticism, but it aims to point out the path and the direction in which inquiry has to move and by which it has to unfold itself comprehensively. Thus, in the truly intelligible, in the intelligible of reason's task, the world of being is transformed into a world of deed. In this new relation between the conditioned and the unconditioned, between the finite and the infinite, between experience and speculation, Kant has wrought a new type of philosophical thinking in contrast to that of Plato and Aristotle. By Descartes and Leibniz, it achieves its systematic perfection and fulfillment. So one of her teachers was the great proponent of Kantian idealism. But the other teacher of Susanne Langer was the exact opposite. He co-authored with Bertrand Russell Principia Mathematica, which completely junked Kantian idealism permanently. When one looks at Whitehead's symbolism, its meaning and effect, he has this kind of language. Chapter 3, the uses of symbolism. He writes, knowingly, the attitude of mankind towards symbolism exhibits an unstable mixture of attraction and repulsion. The practical intelligence, the theoretical desire to pierce to ultimate fact, and ironic critical impulses have contributed the chief motives towards the repulsion from symbolism. Hard-headed men want facts, not symbols. A clear theoretic intellect with its generous enthusiasm for the exact truth at all costs and hazards pushes aside symbols as being mere make-believes, veiling and distorting their inner sanctuary of simple truth, which reason claims as its own. And he goes on in this kind of line. There's an attraction and a repulsion here. Kantian idealism seeks to isolate what is attractive and to pursue that, and to isolate what is repulsive and eliminate that. This kind of equality ends up in promoting what we would recognize today, what was recognized 200 years ago in Kant's time, as an abstraction. The abstract becomes a Kantian purity. And what cannot be abstracted has to be let go. But look here. Let's take the bread wheat. It's true that the grain has abstracted itself from the wings. The grain has increased. There's much more juice there, but there are no wings. Without the hand of man to participate in the sowing of bread wheat, it does not perpetuate itself. It doesn't propagate. So an abstraction in the mind is very useful, has a lot of juice, but without the creative participation of the hand of man, those abstract ideas do not propagate. They're not fertile in that sense. So there needs to be a cooperation. It's like the essence of a Neolithic refinement comes into a symbolic civilization, and the essence of a symbolic refinement comes into an abstraction. But if one leaves it there, if one lets it alone there, if one accepts that as the apex, as the conclusion, that is a dead end. That's a box canyon. It's a form of death. There are no transformations available there. Now, one of the focuses in all this, one of the places where an intelligent placing of the finger, where in this whole confusion, where is the knot that one can put one's finger on it? The knot turns out to be available from one perspective in, say, a rendition like Chapter 6 in The Concept of Nature by Alfred North Whitehead. The chapter is entitled Congruence. One of the basic principles of identity and geometry is congruence. Two triangles are congruent if you can place one on the other. The whole principle of congruence. The aim of this lecture is to establish a theory of congruence you must understand at once that congruence is a controversial question. It is not at all simple. It is the theory of measurement in space and in time. The question seems simple. In fact, it is simple enough for a standard procedure to have been settled by an active parliament. And devotion to metaphysical subtleties is almost the only crime which has ever been imputed to any English parliament. But the procedure is one thing and the meaning another. And he goes on to say, thus, immediate judgments of congruence are presupposed in measurement, and the process of measurement is merely a procedure to extend the recognition of congruence to cases where these immediate judgments are not available. Thus, we cannot define congruence by measurement. It begins to be startling, because one of the great presuppositions, and you find it everywhere, in every level, that somehow congruence is that one has measured exactly and the measurements are the same. But it turns out that in terms of spatial measurement, congruence is not an operative idea at all. It has to include motion. Without temporality in the calculations, congruence cannot be determined at all. So Whitehead goes on to say, congruence depends on motion and thereby is generated the connection between spatial congruence and temporal congruence. Motion along a straight line has a symmetry round that line. And in fact, this is universal happening. If you have a motion of electrons in a straight line, they will generate a magnetic field around that line symmetrically. Thus, one calls that energy not electrical energy, as the electrician calls it, but one calls it more precisely electromagnetic energy. And at that rate, one can then have an idea powerful enough that you can really develop. The idea of electromagnetic energy is very useful. The idea of electric energy tends to be mistaken for something else. It tends to slide all by itself into a mythic analogy which gets ritually reduced. For instance, in the 1700s, when electricity was first being experimented with, it was assumed to be some kind of mystery, magical thing. Phlogiston, it was called at one time. And the very first person to fix it in terms of its perceptual exactness and its conceptual resonance was Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin, in a series of letters to a man named Peter Collinson in London, Collinson put them together in terms of a book. And when Franklin's letters came out in terms of a book, its large readership was neither in the United States nor in England, but in France. And in France, the implications of Franklin's work bore fruit in the next generation, because you had a universal mathematical genius named Fourier, who realized that the ongoing algorithmic changes in that continuity as it happened was something that could be mathematically expressed. And once expressed, that principle could be applied to anything. Thus one had, in the time of Napoleon, a mathematics which is useful even today in terms of exploring star systems, because Fourier transforms. The transformation theory is applicable even to the end of time, is universal understanding. Once one has not a realistic idea in terms of facts, but a realistic idea in terms of symbols, then it can be worked with. Then symbolically it opens up. It opens up not only in terms of conscious vision, which becomes possible on a scale hitherto not even imaginable, but retroactively, or to use the mathematical term, recursively, it changes the whole mix and the elements itself, all the relationalities that came before it, to such an extent that once a powerful symbolic idea is put into play, it changes the language, it changes the ritual, it changes nature to the extent that if one is not superfine about exactness, you would swear, as even Miss Langer did, as Kant did, that the ideas had to come first. They were a priori. They in no way developed out of language. They were there before. They in no way developed out of nature. They were there before. They had to be. But they're not. They in no way have existence before. But they in every way have existence before, once brought into play by the mind. This is a paradox. This is a mystery. To be able to explicate this, one has to move to a synthesizing level beyond a two-value logic. You can no longer talk about things that are true and false. You minimally have to have a three-value logic, which includes a neutral. Not a maybe, but a neutral. And only with the three-value logic do you begin to have the ability to understand how this paradox could be. That ideas are developed out of nature, out of ritual, out of language. But once they're put into play in such a way that they're there not only in the language and in the ritual, but they're there in nature also. So that nature is super mysterious. It's unbelievably mysterious. It not only has its own mystery, but reciprocally, creatively plays with conscious entities, sentient beings, in such a way that it incorporates in its reciprocity elements that were creatively introduced at one period of time, and now are not only there, but seemingly are there even before the beginnings. This is an enormous paradox. Whitehead, in the conclusion to his work, after he's written the entire book on the concept of nature, goes back to a seed that he had as a boy. And he writes that as a boy, he had the pleasure of seeing Euclid in Greek, Euclid the first geometer, Euclid's Elements, written about 2,300 years ago in Alexandria. And the very first sentence in Euclid resonated throughout Whitehead's personality, even as a boy. And it wasn't until he was a very well-developed mathematician that he finally could resolve for himself the mysteriousness of Euclid's first phrase in his geometry. The phrase is given in Greek here. He translates it, quote, that a point is without parts and without magnitude. The better translation is that a point is a focus of no dimension. But the ability to have a powerful idea of a focus with no dimension was not available to Euclid. It was not available to the Greco-Egyptian mind because the Greco-Egyptian mind was based on an esoteric passing of wisdom, one to one to one. And it's only in terms of a distribution of wisdom over an entire field, like all sentient beings, everywhere, at all times, that one is able to bring a three-value logic to bear on this particular definition and understand it, understand the idea so that one can use it in a completely new way. The idea of a locus of no dimension was first resolved in India by a man named Nagarjuna. And he wrote it by just making a circle around a space, which we call a zero today. A zero is the first letter in the word Om, paradoxically. Now, in Indian civilization, wisdom was not passed on in an esoteric one-to-one lineage at all, but was distributed over the entire field of humanity. Whoever could hear it, heard it. Whoever could deepen it, did. And in that civilization, even 400 years before Euclid, the Chandogya Upanishad does not at all decline man from the animals, but says, of life, plants are the essence. And of plants, man is the essence. And of man, speech is the essence. And of speech, the Udgitha, is the essence. And so 700 BC, 2,700 years ago, already in India, one has this declension that places in this phase form unfolding, that in those phases, life, plant, man, speech, symbol, you have a 5-phase transform whose complete cycle ends with a symbol, Om, which factors back into nature in such a way that it doesn't leave a trace at all. Factors, in fact, back into life, so that when one inscribed, whether in Sanskrit or in English or in French or whatever translation you want to have, when one inscribes Om, it always carries an exclamatory quality. Like the Chinese pronouncing not Beijing, but Beijing. It's not Om, it's Om. And once one can say Om with the exclamatory emphasis, the pair to Om also comes out an exclamatory balance. And the pair to it is Shanti. Shanti doesn't just mean peace. It means the peace that passes all understanding. That life occurs in an open-ended matrix, Shanti. And out of that incredible peace comes the vibrancy of life, comes the form of plants, comes the focus of man, comes the utterance of language, comes the interior focus of Om, which vanishes into its exclamation. The letters do not carry it, but the exclamation carries it. Where does it carry it? It carries it with a tremendous creative elan all the way back recursively to the beginnings and acts as if it had always been there. As if there never was a space in which it was absent, never a time in which it did not record. And one asks, is it true? And one comes up with 3 different answers that are all true. It is primordially not the case, not true. It is currently the case, and it has futurely always been the case. So that one ends up with a very paradoxical kind of a form to reality. The very vibrant center was not there. It is here, and it will always have been there, all at the same time. And so one finds occasionally in places in India where such wisdom registers in stone, you find a figure with 3 faces, facing not just the 3 directions of time, but the 3 qualities, the triad, the trimurti, the quality that reality has this quality to it. mysterious. If one takes, instead of the Upanishadic lineage about language, if one takes different way, if one takes a Kantian way, you come up with a different view. You come up with an abstraction. You come up with an idealism. Amazingly, Suzanne Langer, with her two teachers, was given this kind of polarity. An idealism which tends towards an ultimate abstraction, and a process, a cumulative penetration, which finds great affinity not only with the essence of Greco-Egyptian wisdom in Plato. Whitehead said all philosophy is a footnote to Plato, but finds cognate sympathy with Indian yoga. Where is the mystery to all this? Where is the resolution of all this? The finger has to go on language. The resolution is someplace in that field. But deeper than the field of language is that horizon that precedes language. What precedes literacy is numeracy. One has to look to number. There in number, there's something peculiar. So peculiar that it stands out. It's like a glaring explosion of truthfulness, so bright that its brightness obscures all else and so commands our attention that, like a wailing siren going in front of the lecturer, for a split second all you hear is the siren and not the lecturer. Yet the siren is, compared to the lecturer, a distraction. So too, the bright, glaring truth about number is not the extraneous, but is the exact place that one would wish to look, to understand. One of the keys to all this occurs, and you would find it in a place where the principles of mathematics are sifted, refined. Right in the center of Principia Mathematica, this is only the first 56 sections. It's an excerpt put into paperback. The 3 volumes from Cambridge University Press make a huge, if you hit someone on the head with it, you'd give them a concussion. Here in the very middle of it, Section C, Classes and Relations, General Theory of Classes. And the General Theory of Classes has reference to the way in which 2 different orders of number occur together, very often braided together, but are quite distinct. One is the cardinal sequence, the other an ordinal sequence. The core of it, as one would expect when you follow an education like this, the symbolic telling core of it, the seed, is always in the molecular structure of the pair. Old Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, a member of that very esoteric civilization of North China, the Yellow River, always looking for the imperial shortcut exactness, says of the mystery of Tao, one cannot say anything. But of what one can say, the deepest level is the pairing. There is a point at which one comes knowingly to a watershed of what can be said and what cannot be said. And what cannot be said is exactly unsayable. So that one has, for instance, in a little book written in 1931 that's become like a little talisman of modern mathematics and physics and science, on formally undecidable propositions of Principia Mathematica and related systems. There is such a thing as formal undecidability. that one can know that at this particular threshold, one can say this quite exactly, and one cannot say this quite exactly. So that such a great mathematical physicist as J.S. Bell would have a title of a collection of his essays, Speakable and Unspeakable in Quantum Mechanics. One of the great triumphs of the 20th century is the recovery of the ability to know what is and just as precisely what is not. A wisdom which in ancient pre-Socratic Greece was formulated in a mystical poem by a man named Parmenides, The Way of Parmenides, one of Plato's most extraordinarily baffling dialogues is called the Parmenides. And in the Parmenides, the intractable, mysterious trigger is called the argument of the third man. The Hermetic principle of the resolving third is always a mystery, because it's always the threshold precisely between what can be said and what exactly cannot be said. In Parmenides, he put it very succinctly. What is, and what isn't, isn't. And that polarity is disjunctive. They never touch. They never meet. So that the interface between a disjunctive polarity like that only occurs in imagination. Never occurs in nature en naturel, but occurs in imaginative time-space. But if you have a consciousness that's developed and mature enough to include imaginative time-space, one can include not only the is and the is not, but the neutral third value of logic, the 0 point, that both doesn't record and does record. And one finds the old Hermetic principle was the square is a pair of pairs. One of the pairs is cardinal, the other pair is ordinal. In a cardinal series, Whitehead and Russell in Principia Mathematica, section 54, cardinal couples, followed by section 55, ordinal couples. Couples are of two kinds, namely those in which there is no order between x and y, and those in which there is order between x and y. We may distinguish between these two kinds of couples as cardinal and ordinal, respectively. Oddly enough, paradoxically enough, the order is in the ordinal couple, not in the cardinal couple. Why is this surprising? Because the simplest beginnings of language is that ritual action of counting, in which one goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, would seem to be a cardinal order. In fact, we talk about cardinal order. We talk about that line, that cardinal line of number, which has a resonant field around it, symmetrical, by the way. Yet, when one comes to logic, atomic analysis of this, it is the cardinal sequences that have order, and the ordinal, not the cardinal. Here is how Whitehead and Russell write this. In the present and following numbers, we shall define 2 and 2 sub r, 2 and 2 relational, as the classes of cardinal and ordinal couples respectively, leaving it at a later stage show that 2 and 2r, so defined, are respectively a cardinal and an ordinal number. An ordinal couple will be called an ordered couple or a couple with sense Thus, a couple with sense is a couple of which one comes first and the other second. If we have, later on, Whitehead and Russell go into mathematical relationalities, it turns out that there are 4 functions, arithmetic functions, that belong together. 2 of which are totally natural to the cardinal development of an order. 2 of them are not natural to that at all. Addition and multiplication are natural. They're gifts, gratis, no charge, free, to an arithmetic cardinal sequencing. But subtraction and division do not naturally occur. Subtraction and division naturally engender incommensurates in their very activity. And so one has to go to a higher dimension, a higher synthesizing dimension, to incorporate subtraction and division to complete the square. And it's only on an ordinal sequence that one can do this. You cannot do it on a cardinal sequence. So it turns out when you look at realistic functions of facts, even such a simple thing as counting requires a pair of sequences. It's almost like the structure of DNA. The double helix is so deep that even the mathematical possibilities of the universe still have that fertile interpenetration. On this kind of a level of insight, education needs to be cognizant not only of the electric qualities of drawing lines, but of the magnetic resonances that are symmetrical everywhere and are not apparent in nature to their full extent. One has to go into conscious resonance. The difficulty is that nature does not effortlessly accommodate this. And so when consciousness first begins to accumulate, it doesn't accumulate as open fields, as open vistas of vision, but comes as clouds. Clouds of dust, clouds of obscurity. And so as soon as one tries to cross a threshold of nature over that threshold into consciousness, the first thing that happens is obscurity, blurs. Not hearing, not seeing, not understanding. And so the interval for symbols, that book that we've chosen to characterize the interval where integration comes to its ultimate realization, that book is called The Cloud of Unknowing, a 14th century English Upanishad, which discloses, as a good spirit guide would disclose, that the problem is not just that one enters into a cloud of unknowing above you, ahead of you, but that on entering into it, the first thing that happens is the old Paleolithic participation mystique. The cloud envelops you. It's only above you, but it's below you, it's all around. You are immersed in unknowing. The first steps in consciousness are always encountering unknowns. If you don't encounter unknowingness, then you have not begun anything in consciousness at all. If you always are able to follow exactly what's being said to you, you've learned nothing, you're not even learning. Consciousness is not being evoked at all. The universe is not going to play with you. Being able to be there and know that you didn't hear, you didn't understand, begins getting the juices of the universe going to help you to know, to help you to understand. But it takes accumulated penetration to do it. This is why the only thing a chair like this can do is encourage you to continue participating doggedly with tenacity, because all by itself, this accumulated activity engenders the juices needed to digest. The aperitif is the participation constantly. That's what gets the digestion primed. The relentlessness of it engenders and evokes from impossibility the very qualities that one would need. How did Shelley say at the end of Prometheus Unbound? To hope till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. This alone is life, joy, empire, and victory. More next week.